Recent political debates have revolved a bit around the adequacy of free markets. How good are free markets at delivering outcomes that we like for our economy? Chapter 3 is divided up into two sections, one that will focus on the demand side of the market, one that will focus on the supply side of the market. We're going to think about the law of supply and demand, distinguish between the terminology a little bit, the quantity demanded versus demand, and quantity supplied versus supply. We're going to see how markets reach equilibrium and explain what a surplus or shortage is, and explain why a surplus or shortage will cause changes in the market price. One of the goods that we like to just talk about in class because it kind of hits home with everyone is the price of gas. The price of gas is always changing. We always see these spikes in the summertime. We see that on the news they are always reporting the price of a barrel of oil and how that relates to prices of gasoline, prices that we pay at the pump. So we're going to have an overview of the market mechanism, starting with the consumer side, demand. Demand refers to the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded is the amount that consumers are willing and able to purchase at a particular price. What the law of demand says is simple, that there's a negative or an inverse relationship between the price of a good and its quantity demanded. Negative relationship means that if the price goes up, the price of a good or service goes up, then people will buy less of it. If the price of that good or services falls, then people respond by demanding more of the good. The market demand is simply the sum of all the individual demand, all the individuals in a market for a particular good. So if we look at the demand curve for DVDs in this case, we see this single person's demand for DVDs in a year says that if the price of a DVD is $20, then he will buy 4 units in a year. If the price falls to $15, then he will buy 6 units. So his demand for the good, the number of units that he wishes to purchase, increases as the price falls. If the price falls again to $10, then this consumer will increase his demand to 10 units. Finally, at a price of $5, he'll buy 16 units. The law of demand results in a demand curve that graphically is sloping downward from the left to the right. We should note here the difference in terminology that is key, and confusing this terminology can lead to a big misunderstanding. So let's keep it straight. The change in the price of a good changes the quantity demanded. Illustrated graphically, a change in price moves us from a point on a demand curve to another point on the same demand curve. So in this case, the price of DVDs falls from $15 to $10. The quantity of DVDs purchased per year in the entire market goes from 20 million to 30 million. Alternatively, we have some non-price determinants that we'll discuss on the next slide. A change in one of those things can increase demand, like in panel on the right here from D1 to D2. On the first demand curve, at a price of $15, the market demand, the total market demand, is 20 million units per year. Something causes demand to increase, then at that same price of $15, there will be a 10 million unit increase in the quantity demanded. Demand shifts to the right, and at a price of $15, consumers demand 30 million instead of 20 million. So what are the non-price determinants? These are things that determine the position of the demand curve, and if one of these things change, then they can cause the demand curve to shift. This is where we impose our ceteris paribus assumption. If we look at the panel on the left, we're looking at how the price affects the quantity demanded ceteris paribus, that is, holding everything else constant, holding constant all those things that we'll see on the next slide. If we look at the panel on the right, the shift in the entire demand curve is going to be the result of holding all these things constant except for one. So what are the things that influence the level of demand in a market? First is the number of buyers. Notice there's a plus sign there. That means there's a positive relationship between the level of demand and the number of buyers in the market. This makes sense, since the market demand is a sum of all individual demand curves in a market, that if there's an increase in the number of buyers, there will be an increase in demand, holding everything else constant. Second, taste and preferences of consumers. If consumers prefer something for some particular reason, maybe LeBron James wears Nikes, and so it causes an increase in the demand for Nikes, an increase in the preference for Nikes, then that will shift the demand curve to the right. So that's what marketing is all about, right? Changing or affecting consumer preferences. Income is one of the more interesting things. If we think about how income relates to the demand for a good or service, income can have a positive or negative effect, depending on the nature of the good. If the good is what's called a normal good, then the relationship between income and demand will be positive. That is, increases in income would cause an increase in demand for normal goods. So what makes the relationship negative? There are some goods that aren't normal goods. They're referred to as inferior goods. For example, college students eat a lot of cheap food like ramen noodles. But one of the things that happens is when you graduate from college, your income increases, or at least we hope it increases by a very, very large amount. People don't really respond by doubling the amount of ramen noodles that they buy when their income doubles. What do? They buy fewer ramen noodles. In fact, some people may respond to their increase in income by buying no ramen noodles at all. Ramen noodles is an inferior good because when income increases, people respond by purchasing or demanding less of it at all prices. Expectations of buyers has a positive relationship with demand. That is, if buyers expect the price to be higher tomorrow, then they will respond by purchasing more of the good today, holding everything else constant, ceteris paribus, right? If they expect the price to be lower tomorrow, then they may respond by buying less of the good today. Either way, it's a positive relationship because their expectations about price move the same way as their demand for the good. Prices of related goods are interesting. There are two ways that goods can be related. They can be substitutes for one another, or they can be complements. Substitute goods are things like Coke or Pepsi. And so if we think about what happens when the price of Pepsi falls. If the price of Pepsi falls, there would be some people who are hardcore Coke drinkers who wouldn't drink Pepsi if it was free. But there are going to be some people who substitute the now cheaper Pepsi for the now relatively more expensive Coke. So if the price of Pepsi falls, the demand for Coke is going to fall. Vice versa. If the price of Pepsi rises relative to the price of Coke, then people respond by buying more Coke and less Pepsi. Complementary goods will have a negative relationship. If we think about what happens to the demand for hot dog buns if hot dog franks go on sale. The price of hot dog franks falls, people respond by buying more hot dog franks and more hot dog buns to go with them. So complementary goods have a negative relationship. The price of one falls, causes the demand for the other to increase. So this panel shows very clearly the shifts that are possible in the demand curve. An increase in demand, if we start at D1, an increase in demand, a change in one of those things on the list that causes an increased demand will shift that demand curve to the right to something like D2. A change in one of those non-price determinants that decreases demand will cause a parallel shift of the demand curve from something like D1 to something like D3. Right? So we see that those things on the list that we showed before will cause a shift in the demand curve that are graphically represented with this picture here. There's some nice examples of these shifts on pages 55 and 56 in your textbook. So pay special attention to that as you proceed through Chapter 3. Our next presentation will conclude Chapter 3, beginning with the law of supply.